In this video, I'm going to continue my discussion of the intersection between gospel reliability and miracle stories. Here I'm going to talk about two miracle stories that are told together in the Gospels that are known as the Synoptics. You'll find these accounts in Matthew 9, in Mark 5, and in Luke 8. These are the stories of the healing of a woman with a probably gynecological issue of blood that had been going on for about 12 years, and the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter. And I'm not going to give a long summary of those accounts. You can find them in those chapters. They are briefer than the accounts that we have of Jesus' appearances after his resurrection that I discussed in the last video, and they're less detailed in the sense just that you just have fewer accounts with fewer variations and so forth. So we just have less information about these events and the circumstances surrounding them. And so that makes it an interesting set of cases to discuss, to look further at the way that this intersects with gospel reliability. Very briefly, in the stories, this synagogue ruler named Jairus comes to Jesus and asks him to come to his little daughter who is at the point of death. While Jesus is going, they're interrupted because Jesus says someone has touched him, and when he looks around, a woman comes forward and says that she touched his garment, and that she was hoping to be healed of an issue of blood that had been going on for years, and that she now feels in herself that it has stopped. And then Jesus tells her to go her way, that she's been healed. In the meanwhile, the child has died. Messengers come saying that the child has died, but Jesus tells the father to have faith. They go on to the house. Jesus goes in, takes the girl by the hand and says, "Maid, arise," and she immediately gets up and begins walking, and everyone is astonished. Now that's the very short version. We'll be talking a little bit more about some of the details. So the question we want to talk about today is, how much evidence do we have for the observable facts of this event, these two events? You could think of them as two events, but they're intertwined. Today I'm going to talk about the observable facts. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea that these were bona fide miracles. To some extent, you can separate out those accounts, especially in healing miracles. You can separate the question of whether the person was truly healed from the question of whether it was a miraculous healing. So I'm going to talk about that in the next video, also to keep this video from getting really long. But I want to talk about that credibility of these accounts for what the disciples would have seen. You know, if you were there, would you have seen it happen the way that it happens in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Now, the first question we need to talk about here is independence. In the case of the narratives of Jesus' appearances after his resurrection, there's a lot of variety. Some Gospels contain appearance narratives that don't occur at all in other Gospels, whole appearances that don't occur in other Gospels. There are a lot of alleged contradictions, which in itself is a kind of an interesting clue to independence. Independence is something that I've done a lot of professional work on in my probability publication, dealing with non-Christian, non-biblical, hypothetical examples, but just the general notion of witness independence and account independence in history. And very briefly, and without being technical, what we're looking for there when we have independent accounts is an answer to the question, suppose that this event did not occur, would it be surprising for us to have this much similarity between these accounts? Now, obviously, if the people involved have copied their accounts from a common source, we would not be surprised. Even if it didn't happen, if the common source is mistaken and then they're all just copying that, we would not be surprised that they'd all be the same because they're copying it from the common incorrect source. But if they're not coming from a different source, if these from the same source, if these different accounts all have some kind of access to what happened on that day and are telling what happened without dependence, then we get surprised. that they should be so similar. Now that's a very brief overview, and there are further nuances because you can have partial dependence and partial independence. And that's part of what I'm going to talk about here. The three accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke appear very similar. They really are. They're very similar in wording. Some of the most notable differences that Matthew has from Mark and Luke are just omissions. So there's a little argument back and forth between Jesus and his disciples. Matthew just omits that, and other things that he just doesn't have. That obviously is not much evidence of independence, because he could be using, scholars usually think, Mark, I have no special quarrel with that, and then just deciding to leave some stuff out, which does not show that Matthew himself had separate access to what happened that day. So there's less evidence of independence than there is in the accounts of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. There are a couple indicators, though, that Matthew in particular may have had an independent knowledge of this event, and that even if he's using Mark, there's no problem with plagiarism at that time. He nonetheless is adding some things that he himself remembered. He would have already been called as a disciple at that time, or that he had from someone who was there. So the first of these is a little variation. When Jairus first comes to ask for Jesus' help, he says in Mark that his daughter is dying. You know, she's imminently dying. And then in Matthew, when he comes to Jesus, he says, my daughter has just died. Now, some scholars have used this as an alleged discrepancy and have tried to argue that Matthew deliberately changed the time when the girl died, that he made her, as it were, die earlier because he's going to leave out, and he does leave out, the messengers who come to say that she's died, so he just makes her die earlier. I don't think we need to go there. I think that's unnecessarily complex sort of mental process to postulate on Matthew's part. First of all, this is the kind of variation that we get in witness testimony all the time. And the difference between my daughter is dying, she's almost dead, and my daughter is dead is not really that great. It's the kind of thing that you easily could get just from a difference in memory, especially since in both Mark and Matthew, he goes on to say, but if you come and lay your hand on her, she will live. So if you remembered that incident that Jairus said, if you lay your hand on her, she will live, you might remember it as that he said she was already dead. If you're an inerrantist, you can decide whether you would consider that to be an error or not in Matthew's memory. But it is, in any event, I think, evidence of independence. Another possibility is that in his agitation, Jairus said both, and I don't think this is implausible. He's an agitated man trying to get this healer to come to his daughter. My daughter is dying. By now, she's probably already dead. And this response is one that's favored by my husband, Tim McGrew, and I believe it was favored by St. Augustine as well. And I think it's entirely plausible. Again, you'd get a variation there where probably Peter, as Mark's source, remembers that he said she's dying, and Matthew remembers that he said she's already dead. So that's evidence of independence. The second evidence of independence is that there's a little detail that only Matthew mentions. I believe D.A. Carson brings out that only Matthew mentions the flute players. When they arrive at Jairus' house, eventually, there's all this wailing and noise-making for the dead girl, and it includes flute players. This, by the way, is confirmed by external Jewish sources that you would hire flute players sometimes to mourn your dead. They may even have been hired when she was dying, to be sort of on the spot. So that's a little detail that Matthew may have heard of independently, and Carson actually suggests that this independent detail arises from historical memory. So those are some evidences that Matthew's actually is at least a partially independent account, and I think that's interesting. Now I'd like to move on to some markers of credibility specifically in the accounts, and I'll be using chiefly here the longer version in Mark's Gospel. Of course, the flute players are in Matthew's, and that's a mark of credibility in itself. This does not mean that we have to have special markers of credibility in every account, but it's always nice when you do. We do not come to this with amnesia of all the other evidence that we have of the historical reliability of the Gospels in itself. That already gives us a very strong prima facie case that at least the observable facts here are coming from those who would have been witnesses of them, especially the disciples who would have been on hand when these things happened. But now I'm going to also talk about what more we can add to that. So I decided to use notes because there's 9 of them, and I was nervous that I might forget one. Synagogue at Capernaum. These events probably take place in the city of Capernaum based on the context in the Gospels, and we have actually found archaeologically the synagogue at Capernaum. It was at one time doubted that there were synagogues built around in that location that early, but archaeologists have dug down below a more impressive 3rd or 4th century synagogue to a lower level and have found a 1st century synagogue, which still would have been pretty impressive for the time. This is mentioned in another story as well, I believe the story of the healing of the centurion's servant. So that Jairus was ruler of the synagogue, there's some external confirmation. Secondly, it's very credible that the woman would not want her condition to be known. Even now, this would be pretty embarrassing. If you're going to tell your doctor that you've had a gynecological hemorrhage that's lasted for a long time, you want to be private with that doctor and maybe a nurse or something. You don't want to have to go and talk as a woman to a male healer in front of all his male disciples out in public where he's surrounded by crowds and so forth, and all the less so in that culture where her hemorrhage would have made her ceremonially unclean. You'll find even today that very Orthodox Jews will not touch a woman in public because it's forbidden. And by touch, I mean, like touch on the shoulder even. It's forbidden to touch a woman who is having her menstrual period, and, obviously they can't know who is and who isn't. So she would not have wanted this to be known. So it's very credible humanly that she would have tried to obtain healing by coming through the crowd and touching Jesus' garment in this secret way. Thirdly, that there is because there is a delay, the child dies. Now, some people, some scholars will talk about something called a Markan sandwich. I'm generally kind of skeptical even about these Markan sandwiches where they don't call historicity into question. In this case, to say that Mark has tried to organize this as a sandwich would call historicity into question because the so-called sandwich structure is just a result of the flow of events, that Jesus agrees to go and heal the child, and then this woman actually does interrupt him on the way by touching him in the crowd. And then after he deals with that, he goes on. If that's really how the events took place, this has nothing to do with Mark's attempted arrangement. This is just the gospel authors telling it the way it really happened. And I think that's got some credibility to it. If the child is on the verge of death, then if they delay, then that she dies. You can imagine Jairus' impatience as he's standing there as Jesus is talking to this woman, even if it only took a few minutes. Jairus is urgent at the beginning. Please come, because my child is dying. And then he's like, what's going to happen? And then sure enough, they come and say that she's died. The messengers do not believe that Jesus can raise the dead. When they come, they say, she's died, do not trouble the master. That is credible. Again, just the way the human mind works, that you would think, well, maybe he could heal her, but he can't raise the dead. The report of the raising of Lazarus wouldn't even have happened yet because that's at the end of Jesus' ministry. There's only one other account in the Gospels prior to this of Jesus raising the dead, and that would be the woman's son at Nain. Nain is not close to Capernaum. So they may not even have heard of that, or if they did hear of a rumor, may not have believed it. So it's very credible that they would, be fine with him going and trying to get Jesus to heal her, but then when they believe she's actually died, they would say, never mind. Don't trouble the master. Jesus then turns to Jairus and says, don't be afraid, only believe. Now this is credible based on the unity of Jesus' character throughout the Gospels, which I'm going to talk about in my forthcoming book, The Eye of the Beholder. Jesus often says similar things in similar circumstances, even though they're different, accounts, even though they're different stories. And one of the things he does is that he talks to the relatives of those whom he's going to heal, or in the case of Lazarus raised from the dead, and he says, have faith. He says this to Martha, did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God? He says this on several different occasions. So this is typical of Jesus' way of dealing, Jesus' way of talking to the relatives. Then he only takes, it says, Peter, James, and John with him after the messengers come, and he goes on. He takes those privileged three. That comes up in other accounts as well across the Gospels, specifically at the Transfiguration. He takes them up to the mountain when he's praying. At the Garden of Gethsemane, he takes them further into the garden, and so forth. So this, again, appears to be a regular practice of Jesus. Then when they get to the house, this loud weeping and wailing and the flute players and so forth, the noisy mourning, it's kind of unknown to us, certainly not within, what would this have been, a half an hour of the child's death that you'd be like yelling and wailing. But that was typical of the culture of the time. And we have external confirmation of this from Talmudic sources, and we also have Old Testament mentions of weeping for the dead. And so again, this is just a little cultural note that's brought in casually because Jesus puts out the people who are making all this noise. Then Jesus says to everybody, the child is not dead, but asleep. Now, in the Old Testament, we do have references to death as sleep. I may sleep in death, but it's not comforting. It's very ominous. I think it's ominous anyway in the Old Testament uses, but when Jesus uses sleep for death, which he also does in the case of Lazarus, he's using it in a more comforting way and in a way to indicate that he has power over death. And we find that usage, that more comforting usage of sleep, carried over into the Pauline epistles. The early Christians seem to have picked up on it. It's also mentioned in Acts when Stephen is stoned that he fell asleep, meaning that he died. So, and Paul refers to those who are asleep in Jesus. So that seems to have been a manner of speaking, a figure of speech that Jesus used in a different way from the Old Testament that is authentic. And finally, the simplicity of the account of the raising of Jairus' daughter. He just goes in and he just takes her hand and says, "Maid, arise." And it says she got up and she was able to walk. And then he said, "Give her something to eat." There's no bright light. Nobody glows. There's no loud noise. He doesn't, do this or something like that. He just takes her hand and says, "Maid, arise." That's a kind of restraint in that miracle account that is not necessarily typical of ancient apocryphal stories of miracles. In the apocryphal Gospels, when Jesus rises from the dead, there's a giant walking cross that comes out in one of the apocryphal Gospels, comes out of the tomb and it reaches to the sky and that kind of thing. There's nothing like that here. And Jesus doesn't, for example, produce a miraculous meal to some kind of banquet or something to give to the girl. He just tells her to get up, and then he says to them, "Give her something to eat." And it's a great little touch of realism there, that Jesus just returns the household to its normal functioning when he says, "Give her something to eat." He also tells them not to tell anybody in Mark, and as happens elsewhere, that doesn't work. They go and they publish it everywhere. One of these puzzling things that Jesus will do, trying to get people not to noise certain miracles abroad. Of course, this one would be hard to hide anyway, because the girl was dying. Everyone at least knew that, and now is fine. But in any event, that realism there and restraint in the account, I think, is a mark of credibility. Now, we can put these things together. We can put the other evidence we have for gospel credibility together with the marks of credibility and the small marks of independence. with these accounts, and I think we have a pretty strong case that the external observable events actually happened, even taking this historically, not bringing in ideas of inspiration or anything theological of that kind. In the next video, I'll be talking about the question of the miraculous interpretation of what happened, which I would say is also a historical question. It's not like we just have to know that on faith. So I hope you'll come back next time, and thanks for watching.